Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight. Let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. It began, as so many things in St. Mary Mead did, with something small and seemingly harmless, a scatter of bruised apples beneath an old tree, and the faintest trace of bitterness in the air. Miss Marple noticed it on her morning walk, her basket looped comfortably over one arm, her hat slightly askew from the breeze. The garden of Hollyhock Cottage, which usually smelled of dew and roses, carried today a strange tang, something medicinal, faintly acrid, like a tonic left too long uncorked. Odd, she murmured softly to herself, pausing beside the crooked gate. Very odd for October. Lydia Harrow, the widow who lived there, appeared soon after, pale, shawl wrapped tight about her shoulders, moving with the careful precision of one who wishes not to disturb the air. "Oh, Miss Marple?" she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must forgive the untidiness. There was a little cider tasting here last evening." Beatrice Holloway insisted on trying her hand at pressing apples again. Such enthusiasm at her age, though it didn't end well, I fear. Miss Marple tilted her head, the faintest crinkle of concern in her expression. "Oh dear, nothing serious, I hope?" "Just an upset stomach," Lydia replied quickly, too quickly. "She's resting now, under Dr. Lennox's advice." "Nothing to worry about." The older woman nodded, her gaze drifting to the ground where the apples lay. One of them, perfectly round, bore two tiny punctures just near the stem, as though pricked by a needle. Her eyes flicked back to Lydia, who was brushing her sleeve distractedly. On the white wool, a faint greenish smear showed, almost invisible except to someone who noticed such things. Miss Marple smiled kindly, as if nothing were amiss. "And your cider, dear, how was it received?" "Oh, it was splendid," Lydia said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Everyone enjoyed it, especially Beatrice, until she didn't." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Apples can be temperamental, rather like people." "A bad one among the bunch can spoil the lot," Lydia laughed, but it was brittle laughter. "Indeed, you have a way of putting things, Miss Marple. Do come in for a cup of tea, though the place is quite a mess." Inside, Hollyhock Cottage was neat to the point of nervousness. The parlour smelled faintly of polish, and the same strange tang Miss Marple had caught outdoors. On the sideboard stood a jug, earthenware, ringed by a faint sticky halo where cider had overflowed. Beside it, an untouched teacup and a handkerchief folded neatly with a faint, bitter scent. Miss Marple accepted her tea, stirring absently as Lydia talked of village matters, the Women's Institute, the new curate, the difficulty of finding decent house help. But beneath each polite remark ran an undercurrent, like a thread of tension stitched too tightly. When Miss Marple rose to leave, she said, "You mustn't tire yourself, dear. And do let me send some broth over this evening. I can't live on cider and worry alone." Lydia smiled again, this time more genuine. "You are very kind. Beatrice will be better in no time, I'm sure." "Of course," said Miss Marple, "though wasn't it Beatrice who never touched cider owing to her heart condition?" For just a heartbeat, Lydia froze. Then she busied herself with the cups. "Yes, well, she made an exception, silly thing. You know how friends are when pressed." Miss Marple left her with a gentle nod, walking back toward the vicarage as the autumn light softened over the lane. At the vicarage gate, she met Reverend Clement's wife, bustling home with her shopping basket. "Morning, Miss Marple. You've been to see Lydia, I suppose?" "Poor thing. That cider evening sounded rather lively." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I fancy it ended somewhat sourly." "Oh yes, dreadful business," Mrs. Clement said, lowering her voice. "Beatrice Holloway was taken quite ill. Dr. Lennox said something about her pulse being irregular." "Imagine, he's there now, I think." "Lydia insists it was indigestion, but I did hear someone mention foxglove. They do grow splendidly near her orchard, you know." "Foxglove," Miss Marple repeated softly, as if trying out the word. Digitalis, isn't it? Very pretty and very potent. Mercy, yes. I can't abide the thought of poison in a garden. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Ah, but poison and beauty have often shared a root. Later that evening, the village gathered its gossip like fallen leaves. At the post office, Mrs. Price, no relation to Lydia's nephew, confided that Beatrice had been quietly wealthy. Small investments, perhaps a legacy. At the grocer's, someone whispered that Lydia had ordered more sugar and muslin than usual, perhaps for preserves. Miss Marple, sitting by her fire, let the murmurs pass through her mind like the ticking of a clock. She had seen the needle-pricked apple. She had smelled the faint residue on the handkerchief. And now, in the glow of her lamp, she could almost see again the way Lydia's hands had trembled, not from sorrow, but from strain. She picked up her knitting, the soft click of needles filling the room. Her thoughts moved as quietly and steadily as her stitches. If Beatrice Holloway had been poisoned, not fatally, one hoped. The question was not merely how, but why now? After all these years of cordial friendship, Miss Marple recalled that once, long ago, Lydia and Beatrice had been inseparable, before the late Mr. Harrow's death, before the cottage had grown heavy with solitude. Sometimes grief does not fade. It ferments, like cider left too long in the dark. The next morning brought a visitor to Miss Marple's door, young Tommy Archer, the grocer's apprentice, carrying a small parcel. Mrs. Harrow asked me to bring this to Dr. Lennox's surgery, he said, but I saw he'd already gone to the Holloways. She said I might leave it with you, ma'am, if you were on your way that way. Indeed, I shall see it safely delivered, Miss Marple replied, accepting the package. It was wrapped neatly, but a faint dampness seeped through. Cider, perhaps, or something stronger. When she set it down beside her chair, she noticed a faint discoloration on the brown paper, 2 small drops that shimmered pale green in the morning light. That afternoon, she returned to Hollyhock Cottage under pretext of checking on Beatrice's health. The door was answered not by Lydia, but by Mrs. Goodbody, the housekeeper, red-faced, nervous, with a dishcloth clutched like a talisman. Oh, Miss Marple, Mrs. Harrow's lying down. It's such a fright she's had. Poor Miss Holloway's not taken any worse, thank the Lord. Miss Marple smiled kindly. I'm so glad. You've been cleaning, I see. The woman's eyes darted toward the parlour. Oh yes, spilled cider, that's all. I thought best to wash the jug straight away. Miss Marple's gaze followed the woman's glance. Quite right, she said softly. Cider does stain dreadfully. Still a pity. Some stains tell more than they hide. Mrs. Goodbody looked uncertain, then excused herself to fetch a shawl. Alone for a moment, Miss Marple moved toward the window. Beneath the apple tree, still half in shade, lay the same handkerchief she had noticed before, caught among the grass. She stooped, picked it up gently and brought it to her nose. There it was again, that faint, unmistakable bitterness. By evening, word spread that Beatrice Holloway's condition had worsened. Dr. Lennox had sent for a sample of the cider, though Lydia claimed she'd poured it away. Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, knitting slow, deliberate rows. Poured away, she repeated under her breath. And yet the ring remains upon the jug. Her needles paused. No, my dear Lydia, nothing is ever quite poured away in St. Mary Mead. Not cider, and not guilt. And outside, under the apple tree at Hollyhock Cottage, the wind stirred faintly, carrying with it the bitter scent of foxglove leaves and something darker still. Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. Chapter 2. A remark may be tossed lightly across a tea table, but it often lands somewhere heavier than the saucers. Miss Marple knew that better than anyone in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry's drawing-room offered its usual comforts, a coal fire humming to itself, a bowl of late dahlias giving off a peppery sweetness, and a plate of seed cake whose polite squares hid a lavish quantity of caraway. The village had assembled in that gentle, unarranged way it had, people calling in just for a moment, then staying until shadows elongated across the rug. There were the Clements from the vicarage, Mr. Archer, the grocer with his careful smile, Dr. Lennox late and apologetic, and a neat, brisk young man with a city air whom Mrs. Bantry introduced as Mr. Edwin Price, Lydia Harrow's nephew, you know. Such a comfort to his aunt. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting as an unassuming companion, had a view both of the window and of the tea tray. She liked to see who reached for the sugar without looking. Poor Miss Holloway, sighed Mrs. Bantry, slicing the seed cake with a practised hand, quite overcome after that cider evening.
Lydia must be beside herself. Not so beside herself that she forgot to order extra sugar, Mr. Archer observed mildly, accepting his slice.
A very proper lady, Mrs. Harrow, always anticipates a need. Generous too, Edwin put in, a shade too quickly. His cuffs were markedly white, his collar the sort that remembered a steam iron with fondness. Aunt Lydia is much admired for her hospitality. I've told her often that Hollyhock Cottage is a financial burden, but she insists on keeping up her standards. It is an old cottage, said Miss Marple, with gentle interest. Old walls sometimes expect company.
One must oblige them. Dr. Lennox cleared his throat.
Miss Holloway is resting.
I trust we shall see improvement by morning. The, cider was strong for some constitutions. Mrs. Clement exchanged a glance with her husband.
I heard from dear Molly at the Institute that Miss Holloway at first refused the cider quite firmly. Only later did she accept a small glass. Would anyone know why she changed her mind? There was a murmur like the hush before a hymn. Miss Marple's needles paused and resumed their quiet click. Oh, she can be persuaded, Edwin said with a little laugh.
Aunt Lydia has a way with people. Persuasion, Mrs. Bantry mused. Or suggestion?
They are cousins, I always feel. She set the cake plate closer to Miss Marple. Dear Jane, do have another piece. Thank you, Dolly, Miss Marple said, lifting it to her saucer. She noted 2 crumbs that had fallen to the tablecloth near Edwin's elbow. He brushed them away rather briskly, as people do when thoughts prickle. Speaking of suggestion, Mr. Archer put in, someone suggested to me that credit cannot stretch forever. Of course, I do what I can, especially for a lady like Mrs. Harrow, but accounts do add up. He said it cheerfully, as if discussing embroidery cotton. Edwin's smile thinned. You'll find my aunt is perfectly solvent, Mr. Archer. Perfectly, Archer agreed, his tone the essence of agreeable shopkeeping. Still, one likes to see the numbers newly written, so to speak. At any rate, Dr. Lennox said, too loudly, we mustn't distress ourselves. Miss Holloway will pull through. Of course, Mrs. Clement murmured, though hearts are delicate creatures. Foxglove is handsome in a border, but quite the wrong guest to invite to tea. A few glances, half curious, half startled, travelled toward the doctor. Miss Marple's eyes were on the window, where the bare branches edged the grey sky like lace. Reflected in the pane, she could see faces in a faint, watery doubling, Edwin's attentive, Archer's composed, Mrs. Bantry's eager, Dr. Lennox's guarded. It was a merry party? Miss Marple asked, as one might inquire about a jumble sale. Lennox shifted, moderately so. Beatrice, Miss Holloway, was disinclined to drink at first, until someone spoke to her, I've been told, said Mrs. Clement, folding her napkin. A quiet word by the window. Who could that have been? Mrs. Bantry asked, leaning forward. Do say it was someone romantic. It is so dull when the culprit is practical. Dolly, the vicar protested, half amused. Miss Marple smoothed the ribbon on her work bag. Romance and practicality are closer cousins than one thinks. A person may desire a thing fervently and conceal the desire under a list of sensible errands. Edwin had taken out his watch and put it back in his pocket without reading it, which made Miss Marple wonder what time he wished it to be. He reached for more cake, then changed his mind and a moment later accepted a second cup of tea with such alacrity that some splashed into the saucer. It is only that Aunt Lydia shouldn't be troubled, he said, addressing no one and everyone. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Goodbody, is quite useless in a crisis. Oh, I like Mrs. Goodbody, Mrs. Bantry objected. She makes a very stout plum jam, a little heavy-handed with the cloves, of course. But stout, useful in a kitchen, Edwin said with a touch of scorn, is not the same as reliable with a locked larder. Locked? Miss Marple repeated, her voice light as steam.
How wise.
I always think larders are like young choristers, apt to wander. Oh, well, Edwin began, then seemed to recall himself. He dabbed at a non-existent crumb with his handkerchief, a fine linen square faintly scented with some sharp, urban cologne that did not suit the country air.
Aunt Lydia takes precautions.
Country cottages invite pilfering. The faintest shift passed through Dr. Lennox's expression, annoyance shaded by relief. Miss Marple filed away that small, comfortable reaction, the way people settle when a narrative arrives to sit in the empty chair. "Do you know," Mrs. Clement said, lowering her voice, "Mavis at the Institute swears she saw Dr. Lennox and Lydia speaking earnestly by the green yesterday evening, quite earnestly. She said, 'Medicine requires earnest conversation,'" the doctor replied, managing a smile. "I advised a draught. Bitters, perhaps." "For anxiety, bitters," Miss Marple murmured, as if tasting the word. She took a sip of tea. The caraway in the cake left a pleasant warmth. Caraway had a way of lingering politely on the breath. Some flavours cling. Precisely. Mrs. Bantry cried, delighted to be helpful. "I once spilled cider in the back pantry and thought I should never hear the end of it from the scullery maid. It scented the house for a week." "That would be the malic acid," Mr. Archer said, cheerful again. "Sticks like a tail on wash day." Edwin laughed, but his fingers, neat and pale, pressed the rim of his saucer as though testing for a hidden crack. Miss Marple noticed a faint greenish smudge along the cuff edge of his jacket, no more than a whisper of colour. It might have been grass.
"It might not. Have you seen Aunt Lydia today?"
he asked Miss Marple abruptly. "This morning," Miss Marple said. "She was composed, which is the most tiring state of all. Then you'll know she had nothing to do with any mishap." He tried for a light tone and found a brittle one. "I'll be staying at the cottage for a time to help with arrangements." "How good," Miss Marple said softly. "Families should be near when apples are gathered in." There was a short silence. In such moments, gossip chooses its path like water. Mrs. Goodbody herself arrived then, unexpected, standing shyly in the doorway with a small covered plate. "Mrs. Bantry, mum, Mrs. Harrow sends her respects and begs you will accept a pot of crab-apple jelly."
"I made it yesterday, I did," she bobbed, cheeks red, eyes skittering from face to face.
"And the doctor, beg pardon, sir, the doctor is to have a jar for Miss Holloway, if she can fancy it." "How thoughtful," said Mrs. Bantry, receiving the plate with warmth. "You are kindness itself." Miss Marple rose and drifted as if absent-minded toward the hall where Mrs. Goodbody stood.
"How busy you must have been," she said kindly.
"All those muslin bags to strain the jelly."
"One needs strong hands." "Oh, I've them, miss," Mrs. Goodbody said, half proud, half worried.
"But I don't like to think of folks ill after a cheerful evening. It isn't natural." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said, "cheerfulness is like gloss paint. It covers beautifully, but the wood underneath is still the wood it ever was." Mrs. Goodbody's fingers tightened on the plate. "I must be back. There's polishing to finish."
She swallowed.
"The larder shelf sticky as anything. I'll get it right." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured.
"And the key?"
"The key?" Mrs. Goodbody blinked. "Why, on its hook, I suppose. Where else would it be?" But a momentary flicker crossed her face, a quick backward glance that pointed, if one were in the habit of seeing such things, toward uncertainty. When she had gone, Dr. Lennox made a great business of his hat and gloves.
"If you will excuse me, I must look in on my patient again. Please do," Mrs. Clement said fervently.
"And, doctor, if there is anything the parish might do—" "Thank you," he said shortly, and departed. "Now," said Mrs. Bantry, eyes sparkling, "do tell me, Jane, was there a quarrel?" "There must have been a quarrel. There always is before anything interesting." Miss Marple's smile was as mild as milk. "Quarrels take many forms. Some are loud declarations. Others are whispers by a window." Mrs. Clement leaned forward.
"That was it, you know."
Molly saw it clearly. Beatrice at the window refusing the cider with a little shake of her head. Then someone came up beside her and spoke quietly. No one heard what was said, and she took the glass. "Who?"
Edwin demanded. "Too sharp by half." Molly didn't say. Mrs. Clement admitted.
"Only that the person had a dark sleeve and stood turned away from the room. There was a reflection in the glass, perhaps, but she could not be sure." "Dark sleeve," Mr. Archer repeated thoughtfully, looking at Edwin's well-cut jacket and then at his own sober coat. He smiled. "Half the village, then." Miss Marple folded her knitting and tucked the ball of wool into the bag. She did not look at Edwin, nor at Archer, nor even at Mrs. Bantry. She looked instead at the seed cake, at the neat squares growing fewer, and at the crumbs people left behind. One crumb had fallen not on the cloth, but on the polished arm of the chair, where it clung tremulous to a hint of sticky polish. She thought of the cider ring on Lydia's jug. She thought of hands that trembled and voices that did not. "I once knew a lady," Miss Marple said conversationally, "who could persuade anyone to do anything." She never argued. She merely suggested what a considerate person would naturally do. "It is so very hard to refuse consideration." Edwin rose.
"I must go to Aunt Lydia. Forgive me, ladies." His chair scraped.
His tone was careful, but there was a heat beneath it, the kind that burns quietly under a lidded pot. When the door had closed, Mrs. Bantry exhaled a happy little sigh, as though the conversation were a charming play and the act had just ended on a tidy line. "Well, if that is not the most engrossing soupçon of scandal. Dolly," the vicar said helplessly, "do remember Christian charity." "Oh, I shall," she said serenely. "I shall be charitably fascinated." Miss Marple asked for her shawl.
"Oh, thank you, dear."
"A chill is creeping round my shoulders. Autumn is a persuasive season," she added, almost to herself.
"It convinces one to make small concessions." Mrs. Clement walked her to the door.
"You don't think—" "Well, no, of course we mustn't think. We must observe," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Thinking comes later, when there is something to assemble." On the path, the dahlias nodded their sturdy heads as if to say they would weather it. Miss Marple paused to admire them, then glanced at the pane of the drawing-room window. In its faint reflection, she imagined for a moment the scene at Hollyhock Cottage, a figure at the window, a refusal, a murmured sentence, a yielding, a glass lifted with a rueful smile to oblige a friend. She found herself listening for a tone, a change in breath, a whisper of triumph or relief. People broadcast more honestly to glass than to faces. Behind her, Mrs. Bantry called, "Do come tomorrow, Jane." "We shall have more news, I'm certain." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said softly. News has a way of ripening overnight. As she turned down the lane, a breeze teased the hedges, carrying the homely scents of coal smoke and damp leaves, and, if one were very attentive, the faintest ghost of something bitter. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer and walked on, her steps small and steady, her eyes far-seeing. Somewhere in the pattern there had been a nudge, a courteous little push that turned caution into compliance. She would, she knew, find the hand that had done the nudging, and back in Mrs. Bantry's warm room, the talk resumed, and the seed cake diminished by precise squares, as if the village were eating its way toward the centre of a secret. Miss Marple, however, kept her own counsel, for she had heard in the laughter a note that did not belong to comfort, but to strain. It was the sound people make when they believe a matter settled, because everyone has agreed not to look at it too closely. The window would not agree. It remembers faces, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that a single quiet sentence at Hollyhock Cottage had been the difference between refusal and a fatal sip. If fatal, it was to become. Who had spoken it, and why, would not remain hidden long. Chapter 3. It was the sort of morning that promised respectability. The sun, a pale coin behind gauze, laid down thin gold on the hedges, and the postman's whistle carried like something decent and reassuring. But in Miss Marple's tidy sitting-room, the needles of her knitting stopped in mid-click. There had been a small detail, a detail too untidy to fit with the rest. Key. Mrs. Goodbody had spoken of it as being on its hook. People in St. Mary Mead always said that about things they could not
quite locate. It made a lost item sound so much more organized.
Miss Marple smiled faintly. A key that had gone missing had a way of unlocking more than a cupboard. By 10:30, she was walking the lane toward Hollyhock Cottage, ostensibly to bring a small basket of broth and scones. Lydia Harrow met her at the door, drawn but polite, a little surprised and a little too eager to appear not so. "How thoughtful of you, Miss Marple." Such kindness when one is weary. Weary days are better faced with soup than with cider, Miss Marple said cheerfully.
And how is dear Miss Holloway this morning?
Much improved, Lydia said. Dr. Lennox was here early. He says it was a simple digestive upset. Ah, Miss Marple's blue eyes held a mild interest. And yet the doctor looked quite pale himself as he rode past my gate. Lydia's mouth tightened. He takes his patient's troubles to heart. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. A tender heart is easily bruised. They took tea in the little sitting room. The jug that had once held cider was gone. In its place stood a vase of chrysanthemums, the kind florists call hardy because they bloom long after other flowers have given up. Miss Marple admired them politely, then noticed on the mantel a faint line of lighter dust in the shape of a key. "You've misplaced your larder key, I think," she said conversationally. "It happens to all of us." "Oh, Mrs. Goodbody must have it," Lydia said, too quickly. "She keeps such things safe." Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle, and let the matter rest, for now. When Lydia excused herself to take a message, Miss Marple's eyes wandered. On the bookshelf stood an old cookery volume, its gilt title half faded. A faint smudge of grey dust marked where something had once lain across it. She drew her finger along the edge, the outline of a key clear as a photograph. Beneath, a small, folded scrap of paper had slipped between the pages. She lifted it delicately. The note was nothing more than a torn label, brittle with age, bearing only 3 letters, Dig. A little dark stain spread from its edge, and the faint, bitter fragrance of crushed foxglove drifted up. Miss Marple replaced it precisely where she found it. When Lydia returned, she carried a small bottle in her hand, the amber glass catching the light. "You'll think me silly, Miss Marple, but I've been taking a tonic Dr. Lennox prescribed. It gives me strength." Miss Marple leaned forward to examine it.
"How sensible, may I?"
Lydia hesitated, then laughed, a sound too quick and bright.
"Of course. Only a spoonful after meals." Miss Marple uncorked it lightly and caught the scent.
It was wrong for a tonic, sharp, sweet, metallic. She turned the label toward the light. Someone had pasted a strip of paper over the original printing. She could see the edge curling where the glue had failed. "Your doctor's handwriting improves," she said pleasantly, returning it. "He's written restorative so very neatly." Lydia set the bottle aside.
"He's conscientious."
"I depend on him. So kind," Miss Marple murmured. "It's a mercy to have dependable menfolk. So many lose interest once the trouble begins." There was a faint clatter in the hall. Mrs. Goodbody appeared, pink and flustered. "Beg pardon, ma'am. Post for you." As Lydia went to the door, Miss Marple rose and followed Mrs. Goodbody to the kitchen. "Busy morning?"
"Oh, miss, I can't keep up.
"The larder key's gone walkabout."
I swore I left it on the hook, but the good Lord knows. Things have a habit of wandering," Miss Marple said kindly.
"Though they usually wander only as far as the last person who needed them." The woman looked troubled. "It's them young folk, I dare say. Mr. Edwin's come to stay. Up half the night he is."
"I heard him rummaging. In the larder?"
Miss Marple asked mildly. Mrs. Goodbody bit her lip.
"I shouldn't say. I don't know proper." "Of course not," Miss Marple said.
"Still, perhaps we'll find your key." She stepped to the pantry door. The hook was indeed bare. The keyhole, however, bore a faint ring of clean wood, as if the key had been turned more recently than the door had been polished.
"If I may?"
she asked. Mrs. Goodbody nodded.
"I can fetch a spare."
Inside, the larder was tidy. Shelves of preserves, flour tins, and the faint odour of cider lingering despite the scrubbed boards. A jug stood rinsed and spotless, so spotless that even its usual film of apple sediment had been scoured away. Miss Marple bent closer. On the shelf behind it, stuck fast to the wood, was a sliver of paper like the one in the cookery book. It bore the faint trace of a word and a darker smudge. She touched it, sniffed gently. "Foxglove again. Digitalis. How thorough you are," she said when Mrs. Goodbody returned.
"Such cleanliness. Why, the shelves smell positively wholesome." Mrs. Goodbody blushed.
"I do my best, miss." When Miss Marple left, she carried nothing more suspicious than her empty basket, but her mind held more than enough to fill it. The larder keys outlined the missing residue, the bottle labelled anew, all tiny seeds, each waiting to sprout. At the vicarage that afternoon, Mrs. Clement poured tea and listened with her habitual half-shocked, half-pleased expression as Miss Marple mentioned the missing key. "Good heavens, Jane, you do pick up the oddest little threads." "They are only odd until one sees the pattern," Miss Marple replied, selecting a digestive biscuit. "I've found that doors in this world are usually locked for reasons other than security." "Do you think Lydia meant to hide something?" Miss Marple smiled, almost apologetic. "Not at first. Concealment often begins as protection, of reputation, of comfort. Then it grows," Mrs. Clement sighed, "and poor Beatrice lies ill." "The doctor says it may have been something she ate or drank," Miss Marple said softly. "The two are rarely far apart." Evening came cool and pink. At her own hearth, Miss Marple opened her notebook, not for writing but for memory. The incidents arrayed themselves with gentle precision: the pricked apple, the needle-smelling handkerchief, the tonic bottle with its pasted label, the key-shaped dust mark. 4 details, each trivial. But the trivial, in her experience, was what life and death most often depended upon. She sat back, letting the knitting rest across her lap. Somewhere a bell tolled 7. In the sound, she could almost hear footsteps, careful ones, crossing a wooden floor to turn a key, pour from a bottle, wipe a rim. The broth she had delivered that morning would likely be untouched.
Lydia Harrow was not hungry.
Guilt, Miss Marple thought, was seldom an appetite for food. It craved reassurance instead. She rose, went to her window, and looked toward the faint light glimmering beyond the trees where Hollyhock Cottage stood.
"Digitalis," she murmured.
Such a lovely name, almost a lullaby. One must always be careful of lullabies. The breeze carried the smell of autumn apples. It was a comfort, and beneath it, the ghost of something bitter. Miss Marple drew the curtains. "Poor Beatrice," she said softly. "And poor Lydia, too. She does not yet know that protection can so easily become the instrument of destruction." She set her knitting neatly aside. "Tomorrow I shall call on Dr. Lennox," she added. "Men often tell more in what they tidy away than in what they confess." And outside, unseen beneath the apple tree, a single bruised fruit dropped to the ground with a muffled thud.
Rolling once before it stilled, Miss Marple,
smiling kindly, knew that somewhere in Hollyhock Cottage a door had been opened with a key that ought never to have turned. Chapter 4. In St. Mary Mead, clocks were not merely timekeepers, they were confidants. They bore witness to arrivals and partings, to whispered words and late-night regrets. Miss Marple, who had long believed that time itself was a gossip of the most reliable kind, was not surprised when the clock at Hollyhock Cottage began to tell a story of its own. It began with Dr. Lennox, neat, brisk, and slightly harried, appearing at Miss Marple's garden gate with an awkward smile and an air of professional courtesy that was a little too deliberate. "Miss Marple," he began, adjusting his gloves, "I trust you've heard Miss Holloway is improving. Quite remarkable, really." "I am delighted," Miss Marple replied gently. "Digitalis, when used correctly, can both weaken and strengthen, can it not?" The doctor's eyes flickered just once.
"Ah, yes."
"In small doses it steadies the heart, and in larger?" He smiled thinly. "Best left to the imagination." Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied with a perfectly harmless botanical observation. "You've been very attentive to Mrs. Harrow. She speaks highly of your care." A flush rose to his pale cheek. "She is a sensitive woman, Miss Marple. A friend of long standing. How comforting," Miss Marple murmured.
"And how precise your friendship must be, to the very minute, I imagine. I do admire punctuality." He frowned slightly.
"I beg your pardon? Only that your visit last night was at 10, was it not?" His mouth opened, then closed. "So she said?" "Yes, perhaps around that time." "Ah, then the church clock was wrong, I suppose." "I heard it strike the 1:15 just as I passed the green, and you were still standing by the gate." He hesitated.
"Perhaps I lost track of time," Miss Marple smiled.
"Yes, I expect time does slip away when one has something on one's conscience, or something to protect." The doctor drew himself up. "Really, Miss Marple, I must get on."
"I have patients waiting." "Of course," she said mildly, watching as he strode away. his hat pulled low.
They do tend to wait when time itself refuses to move. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to Hollyhock Cottage under a veil of gentle drizzle. The air smelled of wet earth and cider apples gone soft. Inside, Lydia Harrow was by the hearth, her face pale and strained, her hands clasped tight. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said, trying for cheer. "You must forgive the gloom. The clock has stopped again. Dreadful nuisance." Miss Marple followed her gaze to the mantel. The ornate little carriage clock had indeed ceased, its hands forever pointing to 10. 10 precisely, she remarked.
"A decisive time. The spring has been faulty for years," Lydia said quickly.
"I keep meaning to have it repaired." Miss Marple moved closer, examining the clock without touching it. A faint residue of candle wax gleamed in the crevice beneath the casing, like the whisper of a secret long kept. "You used a candle, perhaps, to coax the spring?"
"Oh, well, I tried to see if the mechanism had dust."
"It must have been that. How practical," Miss Marple said softly. "One must sometimes warm things to make them run again." "People too, perhaps." Lydia busied herself with tea. "It's only a clock, Miss Marple." "Of course," she replied. "Yet clocks are curious creatures. They tell us when we should be honest and when we should pretend." As they sipped tea, the silence between them thickened. The only sound was the soft hiss of the fire. Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the side table, where a small, folded napkin concealed something beneath. A medicine bottle, perhaps, or a vial. She did not lift it. Observation was always better than interference. Mrs. Goodbody entered then, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. Dr. Lennox called again. "Ma'am," said he'd left his stethoscope by mistake.
"But I saw him slip something into his bag. Another bottle, maybe." Lydia's head snapped round.
"You must have been mistaken, Goodbody. The doctor doesn't steal from his patients." Mrs. Goodbody's colour rose. "Beg pardon, ma'am." "I only said what I saw," Miss Marple interjected softly. "Honesty is a frightful burden in a small village, my dear, but a useful one." Lydia forced a smile. "You know how talk spreads."
"I can't have idle words upsetting Beatrice." "Ah," Miss Marple said gently. "And she is awake?"
"For moments only. She mutters nonsense, something about the wrong glass. It breaks my heart." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the clock again. 10 o'clock, fixed, unyielding. "People often say nonsense when they're closest to the truth," she said. At the vicarage that evening, Miss Marple shared a quiet supper with Mrs. Clement. "Do you know," she said, stirring her tea absently, "there's something curious about clocks. They stop not only when their springs fail, but also when they are tampered with, ever so slightly, to give a false impression." Mrs. Clement frowned.
"Tampered with?
"Surely no one would—" "Perhaps," Miss Marple mused, "to alter when a doctor left a house, or to suggest that certain hands were elsewhere at a crucial moment." "You mean Dr. Lennox?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, "that the truth keeps better time than people do." Mrs. Clement shivered. "You do make me feel most uncomfortable, Jane." "Then I must be on the right track," Miss Marple said cheerfully, finishing her tea. That night, the wind rose again, moaning softly through the apple trees outside Hollyhock Cottage. In the glow of her fire, Lydia Harrow sat unmoving, staring at the clock that would not tick. On the table beside her lay the tonic bottle, half empty now, and her shawl, damp at one corner, as though tears had fallen there. When the doorbell rang, she startled, then composed herself before answering. Miss Marple stood there, a small figure haloed by rain and lamplight. "Forgive the intrusion, dear, but I've brought you a little something for the nerves. Chamomile and valerian, quite harmless, I assure you." "How thoughtful. But you needn't have troubled yourself." "Not at all," Miss Marple said, stepping inside. Her gaze flicked once to the clock, still frozen at 10. "You mustn't worry about that poor clock. It will run again, in its own time."
"Everything does." Lydia swallowed hard. "You think so?"
"Oh yes," Miss Marple said. "Even guilt. It ticks along quite faithfully even when no one can hear it." For a moment, the two women looked at each other, one calm, one trembling. Then Miss Marple smiled her mild, grandmotherly smile, and the moment passed like a shadow over a flame. When she left, the lane was empty, save for the sound of the church bell marking 9. Yet, as she reached her gate, a faint light flickered behind the cottage window, and in it, for one instant, She thought she saw Lydia's hand reach out,
as though to move the clock's frozen hands. The next morning brought fresh gossip to the village.
The verger who had passed the cottage late swore he'd seen a figure slip into the side garden just before the church bell struck 10. Dark coat, small build, he said.
Could have been the doctor.
Could have been that nephew, Edwin. Miss Marple listened, nodding, her knitting in her lap.
And was the figure coming or going, Mr. Verger? Coming, I think. Ah, Miss Marple murmured.
Well, then the clock was not wrong after all, only the people watching it. She looked out toward the orchard, where the last apples hung heavy, and the air was sweet with rot. There, beneath the branches, truth was beginning to gather like autumn fog, quiet,
patient and unstoppable, and Miss Marple,
smiling kindly, knew that the hands of the clock had not merely stopped at 10, they had paused on the very moment when deception began to tick. Chapter 5. Morning in St. Mary. Mead dawned pale and proper, the kind of day when even the gossip seemed to wait for permission to begin. Yet, inside Mr. Archer's grocery shop, beneath the steady tick of the clock and the faint scent of coffee grounds, Miss Marple could feel the hum of things unsaid. She had come, she claimed, for a packet of tea and a length of string. In truth, she had come for something less tangible, the pulse of the village itself, which always beat loudest where the scales and ledgers lived. "Good morning, Mr. Archer," she said brightly as the grocer emerged from the back room,
polishing his spectacles with unnecessary vigour. Ah, Miss Marple, always a pleasure. Some more Darjeeling today? Oh, Darjeeling, I think.
"The weather calls for delicacy," she smiled, her eyes flicking toward the open ledger on the counter, not prying, merely seeing. "You do keep such meticulous books." "Habit, ma'am. The only way to run a respectable shop." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And a respectable shop often knows more about its patrons than any confessor." Mr. Archer chuckled, slightly uneasy.
"Oh, I shouldn't say that." "No, of course not," Miss Marple murmured.
"Though I imagine you know who prefers credit and who pays promptly." He hesitated, then leaned closer. "Between ourselves, Mrs. Harrow's account has grown."
"Substantial of late?"
"Odd for a lady of her standing."
"Sugar, muslin, and—" he flipped a page, "a tin of arsenate powder."
"For garden pests," she said. "How thrifty," Miss Marple remarked mildly. "One must keep one's apples free of blight." That's what she said. Still, she's been nervous. Asked me to send the parcel through young Tommy rather than have it delivered. "Confidential," she said. "Ah," Miss Marple said, as if that were the most natural word in the world. "Confidential things do like to travel quietly." Mr. Archer nodded. "You know, Miss Marple, I sometimes think half this village keeps secrets in paper parcels." "Indeed," she agreed. "But the paper, Mr. Archer, always tears in the end." When she stepped outside, the autumn air carried the scent of crushed apples and damp paper, a perfume of decay and disclosure. Across the road, Edwin Price was locking his bicycle outside the post office, his expression sour. He turned at her greeting with forced politeness. "Miss Marple, you're abroad early. One must seize the day," she said.
"And you, Mr. Price, so industrious."
"Running errands for your aunt, I suppose?" He frowned. "A man must manage what women neglect."
"My aunt has no head for money, yet she keeps her accounts, or so Mr. Archer says." "Mr. Archer talks too much," Edwin snapped.
"I've told Aunt Lydia to settle the bill, but she insists on her old ways." "Ah, the old ways are comfortable. Until the thread phrase." Miss Marple smiled. "I'm sure she appreciates your guidance." He muttered something about family duty and cycled away with unnecessary force. The wheel struck a loose stone, sending up a small spray of dust that settled like punctuation. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call to the vicarage. Mrs. Clement, who always seemed to know when tea was needed,
had already set out a tray. "You've been to Archer's," she guessed. "And what have you learned this time?"
"That honesty costs nothing," Miss Marple said, "but information apparently is quite affordable. Do you think money's at the heart of this?" "My dear, money is rarely the heart of anything, merely the pulse. The heart is always pride or fear." Mrs. Clement looked scandalized, which Miss Marple found reassuring. "Do you mean Lydia Harrow's pride?"
"Perhaps."
"Or someone else's fear? They are often married in secret." When dusk fell, Miss Marple took her usual evening walk, basket in hand. The path led past Hollyhock Cottage, where lamplight glowed faintly behind drawn curtains. In the quiet, she could hear Lydia's voice, low, urgent, and a man's reply, clipped and angry. Edwin, most likely. The words were indistinct, but the tone was all too clear. A reckoning of debts not merely financial. A soft clatter followed, perhaps a bottle striking wood, then silence. Miss Marple lingered only a moment before moving on. She was not one to eavesdrop, but she had long ago learned that the truth does not need an invitation. It merely needs listening. The next morning brought a small but significant discovery. Tommy Archer appeared at Miss Marple's gate, cap in hand. "Begging pardon, ma'am, but could you tell Mrs. Harrow I can't find the parcel she asked me to fetch back? The one from the grocer's. It's gone missing." "Missing?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "When did you last see it?" "Yesterday, ma'am. It was in the basket of my bicycle when I stopped to speak to Mr. Price. He said he'd take it on to the cottage for me, seeing as he was going that way." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very helpful of him." "Yes, ma'am. Only Mrs. Harrow says she never got it." "I see. And what did the parcel contain?" Tommy hesitated. "Small glass bottle, ma'am. I could feel it through the paper." Later, in her parlour, Miss Marple poured herself a small glass of cider, homemade, with a gentle tartness that made her smile. She set it beside her as she examined her notes. Lydia's account at the grocer's, unusual purchases. A parcel, missing. A nephew, too eager. A doctor, too pale. A tonic, mislabelled. A clock, stopped at 10. The pieces formed not yet a picture, but the faint outline of one, the kind you glimpse in needlework before the colours fill in. She rose, went to her desk and opened a small drawer. Inside lay a pressed sprig of foxglove from her own garden, kept as a warning rather than a keepsake. Its purple bell still glimmered faintly. She touched it gently. "So easy to mistake beauty for innocence," she murmured, "and poison for cure." That evening, Mrs. Bantry arrived unannounced, cheeks flushed with news. "My dear Jane, have you heard? Lydia Harrow's been to see the vicar about Beatrice's will." Apparently Beatrice meant to change it, to leave something to the school instead of her, or so Edwin says. "Indeed?" Miss Marple said mildly. "A most commendable generosity, so on Beatrice's part, I mean." "Oh, there'll be no end of trouble," Mrs. Bantry declared with satisfaction. "You mark my words, we'll always make the dead seem most inconveniently alive." "Quite," Miss Marple said softly. "And those who stand to gain seldom sleep well until the ink is dry." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "You make it sound rather grim," Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gentle. "Only truthful, my dear. Grimness is optional." That night, the village air was still and cool. From her window, Miss Marple could see the faint glow from the Harrow orchard. Somewhere beyond it, a branch broke under the weight of an over-ripe apple, falling soundlessly into the grass. She closed her notebook with a soft click. "Apples, ledgers, and debts," she murmured. "They all ripen in their time." And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that one of those debts, the quietest one of all, was about to come due. Chapter 6. In St. Mary Mead. Small creatures had an uncanny instinct for unease. Cats vanished before quarrels, dogs whimpered when tempers soured, and even the vicar's canary, bright as a lemon drop, could sense the chill of a lie before any human ear caught it. So when Miss Marple visited the vicarage that Tuesday morning and found the canary sitting motionless, feathers fluffed, she paused at once. My, she murmured. So even the innocent have taken to silence. Mrs. Clement, fussing with a tray of scones, sighed. "It's the strangest thing, Jane. He's sung every day without fail until Lydia Harrow stepped through the door just now. Then not a chirp. I swear he knows something." "Animals often do," Miss Marple said softly. "Their consciences are clearer." She turned to the parlour, where Lydia sat by the window with folded hands. Her gloves, fine kid leather, were immaculate, save for a faint brownish ring where the fingertips had brushed something that left its mark. On the third finger of her left hand, beneath the gold band, was a trace darker still, like the shadow of an old stain that refused to fade. "My dear," Miss Marple greeted, settling opposite her. "I'm glad to see you out. So few people take fresh air when their minds are troubled." Lydia smiled, brittle and weary. "Dr. Lennox insists I move about. I prefer company to solitude these days." "Quite right."
"Company does one good as long as it doesn't come in bottles," Miss Marple said lightly, pouring tea.
"Sugar?" "None, thank you."
"I've gone off sweets." "Strange," Mrs. Clement said. "Since your housekeeper told me you'd been preserving apples again." Lydia blinked. "Did she?"
"Oh, yes, of course." "Habit, I suppose." Miss Marple stirred her cup.
"Habit is a dangerous comfort," she murmured.
"One can grow so used to it that one forgets what began it." For a moment, Lydia's eyes flickered toward the window, where a pair of sparrows fluttered in the ivy. "I wish people would stop talking, Miss Marple."
"There's gossip about the cider, about poor Beatrice, and even about Edwin." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said. "Edwin does attract comment. A young man of ambition, I believe."
Lydia's lips tightened. "Ambition is not a sin." "No," Miss Marple said gently, "but it does tend to bruise easily when paired with need." The door opened then, and Edwin himself appeared, brisk, well-groomed, and carrying the faint odour of cold ink and city smoke.
"Aunt Lydia," he said, "I thought I'd find you here. Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple." "How nice of you to join us," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly.
"I was just admiring your aunt's gloves. So well cared for." He looked briefly annoyed. "She has better things to do than fuss with gloves." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "And yet the smallest marks can tell such interesting stories," Lydia interjected a little sharply. "Miss Marple sees stories in everything. That's what makes her such good company." The tension lingered like perfume after a guest has gone. Edwin moved restlessly about the room, adjusting ornaments that needed no adjustment. "I'm handling Aunt Lydia's affairs," he said. "The solicitor wants an inventory of her late husband's papers." "How dutiful," Miss Marple murmured. "I do hope you found what you sought." He hesitated.
"I found enough." My uncle was less prudent than he appeared. Lydia's hand trembled, the teaspoon clinking against the china.
"That's quite enough, Edwin." Miss Marple watched over her teacup. "Families," she said gently, "always know where to find the tender spots. Though I suppose Beatrice Holloway knew a few of those too." Edwin's composure wavered for a heartbeat. Miss Holloway was an interfering woman. "Ah, but interference is sometimes just concern misdirected," Miss Marple said.
"And she was concerned for you all, wasn't she?"
"Concerned?" Lydia echoed faintly. "She meant to ruin me, Jane. She was going to tell things better forgotten. Things have a way of being remembered whether one wishes them or not," Miss Marple replied, her tone kind but unyielding. "Memory, like foxglove, can be both remedy and poison." Later, as Lydia and Edwin departed, the canary lifted its head and began to sing, a trembling, golden stream of sound that filled the quiet room. "Well," Mrs. Clement whispered, "if that isn't strange." "Not strange at all," Miss Marple said. "Creatures breathe easier once danger leaves the room." That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the post office, thinking over what she had seen. Lydia's gloves, the faint ring beneath her wedding band, Edwin's agitation, all small signs. Yet together they murmured a single word: guilt. Not of the same sort, perhaps, but intertwined like vines on an old wall. At the counter, she purchased a halfpenny stamp and chatted with Mrs. Price, who leaned forward with the unashamed hunger of gossip. "Such goings-on, Miss Marple. They say Dr. Lennox visits Hollyhock Cottage twice a day now, and that the nephew's taken over the accounts. Between them, they'll have that poor woman half mad." "Oh, nonsense," Miss Marple said with a twinkle. "Mrs. Harrow has excellent sense, though sometimes sense chooses strange companions." Mrs. Price nodded, satisfied without understanding. That evening, Miss Marple dined with the vicar and his wife. Over the pudding, she produced a photograph she had borrowed from the Women's Institute records, an old snapshot of the school committee. Beatrice Holloway at the centre, Lydia beside her, both smiling beneath the apple tree behind the cottage. "Goodness," Mrs. Clement said, "they look almost like sisters." "They were close once," Miss Marple said, "before pride and fear divided them." Notice anything odd? The vicar squinted.
That bit of dried flower stuck under the glass?
Yes, a pressed petal, foxglove of all things, preserved as a keepsake. One wonders who placed it there and why. Mrs. Clement shivered.
Do you mean? I mean, Miss Marple said softly,
that some memories are kept not out of affection, but to remind one what must never be repeated. When she returned home, the village was dark and hushed, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of an owl. Miss Marple lit her lamp, the flame trembling faintly. On her small writing table lay her notes: clock, tonic, larder key, ledger, gloves, foxglove petal. One by one, they were knitting themselves into a pattern too tidy to be chance. She paused, listening. Somewhere beyond her garden, a faint cry, not of pain, but of surprise, echoed, then faded. A shutter closed swiftly in the distance. Miss Marple set down her pen.
Ah, she said softly.
The song ends. The canary at the vicarage had resumed its music because danger had left the room. But danger, she thought, had merely changed its tune, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that the truth, like the canary, could not be silenced for long. Chapter 7. The harvest moon rose like a golden coin over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a deceptive calm. It was the night of the annual harvest supper, that most respectable of social occasions, where roast chicken, baked apples, and gossip were served in equal measure. Beneath the bunting and soft laughter, however, Miss Marple felt the faint prickle of something coiled and waiting. People always relax when the candles are lit, she murmured, settling into her chair beside Mrs. Bantry. But candlelight hides nearly as much as it shows. Mrs. Bantry laughed, adjusting her pearls.
Oh, Jane, do behave.
It's a supper, not an inquest. That remains to be seen, Miss Marple said mildly. On the long trestle table, 3 jugs of cider gleamed amber beneath the lanterns. The vicar had insisted each bear a neat label: Lydia Harrow's homemade, Archer's reserve, and the Women's Institute batch. Simple enough, or so it seemed. Miss Marple had suggested the arrangement herself. She had also quite discreetly asked that 1 jug be left untouched until the toasts were done. Lydia Harrow sat near the centre, her posture graceful but taut. Edwin Price stood at her elbow, smiling with the confidence of a man certain of his superiority. Dr. Lennox hovered farther down the table, eyes darting between the two like a guilty pupil awaiting reprimand. As Grace concluded, the cider was poured. The vicar's wife raised her glass, then hesitated, her eyes flicking to Miss Marple, who nodded once, faintly. Harvest, Mrs. Clement said brightly. A time of gratitude and plenty. Indeed, Miss Marple said, taking a small sip. And of reckoning. The first to notice something amiss was Mr. Archer, who coughed discreetly and muttered, "Stronger than I remember." His cider, Miss Marple noted, was from his own jug. Lydia, meanwhile, lifted hers, the one she had labelled with her name, and as someone leaned in to speak, quietly switched it with the glass beside her. Mrs. Bantry caught the motion, eyes widening.
"Jane!"
she whispered. "Hush, dear," Miss Marple said softly. "We're merely observing human nature at work." Across the table, Edwin Price raised his cup, making a show of generosity. "To Aunt Lydia, Max. May her apples never sour." The laughter that followed was uneasy. Lydia's smile flickered, then steadied.
"And to family," she replied.
"For they ripen with time, though not always sweetly." Dr. Lennox choked slightly on his drink. Miss Marple dabbed her lips with a napkin.
"Such lovely sentiments."
"Tell me, Dr. Lennox, was it you or Mr. Archer who advised Mrs. Harrow on her tonic?" The doctor blinked.
I only recommended a general restorative." "How curious," Miss Marple said.
"Because the label on the bottle shows 2 hands' work. One neat, medical, the other quite unsteady." Edwin's cup froze halfway to his lips. "Are we turning supper into a chemistry lesson?"
"Oh, no," Miss Marple said kindly.
"Only into a confession." The vicar's voice faltered in a hymn. The room stilled, as though the air itself had drawn breath. Miss Marple rose slowly, her knitting still in her lap, her tone as calm as Sunday tea. "It is such a comfort," she said, "that truth like yeast rises when stirred. A few evenings ago a lady fell ill after drinking cider. We were told it was an accident, yet the same jug was later scrubbed clean, far too clean. A bottle labelled tonic bore the faint scent of digitalis, and a missing key found its way beneath a cushion in Mrs. Harrow's chair." Mrs. Bantry gasped. Miss Marple continued gently, "Digitalis, foxglove, grows in abundance beneath the apple tree at Hollyhock Cottage. It strengthens the heart in tiny doses, but in larger ones, well, it quiets the most inconvenient of pulses." Lydia rose, trembling. "You dare suggest—" "My dear, I suggest nothing.
I merely observe." Miss Marple's voice softened.
Miss Holloway refused cider that night, Auntie, until someone whispered to her. Someone who wished her to take what she ought not. Dr. Lennox stood suddenly.
"Enough, Miss Marple."
"You cannot accuse without proof." "Proof?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Then perhaps you'll explain why you tampered with the mantel clock, melted wax, to fix it at 10, to give yourself an alibi you did not need. You feared scandal, not guilt." The doctor's face drained of colour.
"Ah, yes, I was there at 10.
"But only to bring Lydia a sedative." She was distraught. "Indeed?" Miss Marple said softly. "And afterward, when Miss Holloway began to suspect that her tea, not her cider, had been altered, she wrote a note for her solicitor. Unfortunately, she never delivered it." A murmur rippled through the crowd.
Edwin's hands clenched.
"If you're implying my aunt—" "Oh, not alone," Miss Marple said. "No woman of Lydia's refinement would have known how to disguise the bitterness of foxglove without assistance. She had help, someone who fetched the parcel from the grocer's, someone eager to see his inheritance secured. But she could not bring herself to harm Beatrice outright, could she?"
"Only to frighten her."
"It was your meddling, Mr. Price, that turned fright into fatality." Edwin's face blanched.
"You have no evidence."
Miss Marple smiled. "Only the bottle you dropped near the orchard this morning."
"I found it beside the fallen apples."
"It carries both your fingerprints and hers." A long silence followed. Lydia's eyes closed. Edwin's breath came shallow. "I meant to stop him," Lydia whispered. "He said she'd ruin us both, that she'd tell what happened years ago, how I used foxglove to calm my nerves."
"I only meant to frighten her, Jane. I swear it." Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm.
"The road to murder, my dear, is always paved with good intentions and whispered excuses." When the constable arrived, summoned discreetly by the vicar, the cider still glimmered untouched in its jugs. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded, as Lydia was led away with quiet dignity, and Edwin with none. Mrs. Bantry exhaled shakily. "Well, Jane, I must say, your supper parties are never dull." "Nor yours, my dear," Miss Marple said, rising. "But I prefer a simple tea." Fewer confessions, more comfort. As the guests dispersed, the apple-scented night folded softly around the church hall. Miss Marple lingered by the doorway, watching the harvest moon climb higher, serene, impartial, watching over both the innocent and the guilty. "Human nature," she murmured. "So dreadfully consistent, and yet so very fascinating." And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that her gentle snare had caught more than a culprit that night. It had caught the truth itself, ripened and ready for harvest. Chapter 8. The morning after the harvest. Supper broke clear and cold, the kind of morning that makes everything seem sharper, the sky, the breath, and the memory of what has been done. At Hollyhock Cottage, a pale sun fell through the branches of the apple tree, glinting on the frost that clung to the fallen fruit. And there, beneath that tree, stood Miss Marple, her small figure steady against the chill, her gloved hands folded neatly on the handle of her umbrella. "It began here," she said softly, "where most endings do." Behind her, the constable shifted his feet, uncertain whether he was being spoken to or merely allowed to listen. Lydia Harrow sat nearby on the garden bench, her shawl drawn tight, her face ashen and still. Edwin had already been taken to the station, his protestations fading into the morning mist like a bad dream at dawn. "I only meant to frighten her," Lydia whispered again, her voice no louder than the rustle of leaves. Beatrice was going to tell everyone about the old tonic, about how I used to take it after my husband died. She said it wasn't safe. She threatened to go to the doctor. Miss Marple turned, her expression gentle, almost pitying, and instead of confession you chose concealment.
Oh, my dear, would you have been forgiven for the weakness of grief?
But deceit, once begun, requires feeding. Lydia's hands clenched. Edwin said she'd ruin me, that people would talk, that I'd be pitied. He said one drop in the cider would make her ill, not dead.
It was supposed to be harmless. Poison is never harmless, Miss Marple said softly.
It merely chooses the quietest victims. The constable cleared his throat awkwardly. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but how did you come to know it was the cider first and not the tea? She smiled faintly. Because of the ring on the jug, of course. A ring forms only when something is poured carelessly, and Lydia Harrow was never careless. Someone else handled that cider, someone nervous and hasty. But when poor Beatrice began to recover, it was the tea that finished what fear had started. That second act bore Lydia's hand alone. Lydia let out a quiet sob. I wanted her silence.
I didn't mean no, Miss Marple said gently. None of us ever mean to go so far.
But the smallest sins, like the smallest seeds, grow if watered by desperation. Inside the cottage, the parlour was just as Miss Marple remembered, tidy, too tidy, as if cleanliness could scour the soul. On the mantel, the little clock ticked once more, its hands moving freely now. Time, having been tampered with, had found its own rhythm again. Dr. Lennox stood by the hearth, pale and drawn. I've given my statement, he murmured. God forgive me, I knew she was misusing the tincture.
I should have destroyed the bottle. I was afraid of scandal. Miss Marple looked at him kindly.
You feared talk more than truth. You are not the first man to mistake silence for virtue. He bowed his head. Will she? She will stand trial, Miss Marple said softly. But mercy is a curious thing, Doctor. It often begins where punishment ends. She picked up the photograph that had once sat beneath the mantel clock, Beatrice and Lydia beneath the apple tree, smiling in another autumn. The pressed foxglove petal still clung to the glass, brittle but intact.
How strange that you kept this, she said.
A reminder, perhaps, of beauty, or of danger, disguised as beauty. I couldn't bear to throw it away, Lydia said faintly. It was from the first summer after I married. Beatrice pressed it for me. She said it was lovely and lethal like temptation. Miss Marple nodded. Then she saw further than neither of you guessed. Outside, the village was already stirring. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement told the postmistress in confidence that Miss Marple had known all along. Though how?
No one could quite say. Mr. Archer declared it was the ledger that did it. Mrs. Bantry swore it was the gloves.
And the verger insisted that the apple tree itself had whispered the truth, if one listened closely enough. Miss Marple, walking home through the crisp air, heard their theories in passing and smiled.
Human nature, she murmured.
So endlessly inventive, even when it seeks to explain itself. She paused at the lane's bend, glancing back toward the cottage. Beneath the apple tree, the constable was shaking his head, brushing frost from his boots. A small red fruit fell just then, landing with a soft thud in the grass, bruised but whole. Every apple, she said quietly, has a blemish if one looks closely enough.
It is what one does with it that matters. That evening, by her own fireside, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, the soft rhythm of the needles like a clock set right again.
The radio murmured faintly in the corner, a hymn drifting through the static. The cottage was warm, the tea was mild, and the peace was hard won but complete. As the hour struck, she allowed herself a small sigh, half relief,
half reflection. Murder, she said softly, is never born of wickedness alone. It grows out of fear, of exposure, of shame, of the truth itself.
And fear, once planted, bears the bitterest fruit. The fire crackled.
Outside, a single owl called from the orchard.
The sound was not mournful but solemn, like a benediction, and in the hush that followed, Miss Marple, smiling kindly, laid aside her knitting and whispered to the flame, "The truth at last has ripened beneath the apple tree." Candlelight Mysteries. And so, dear listener, Our tale draws to its quiet close, the flame reduced to a soft and steady glow, the shadows retreating once more into silence. In St. Mary Mead, the air grows calm again, and Miss Marple's knitting needles resume their patient rhythm, each stitch a meditation on human nature, its tenderness, its folly, and its unspoken griefs. Perhaps tonight, as you sit by your own flickering light, you will think of Hollyhock Cottage, of the secrets left upon its doorstep, and of the truth that finally came knocking. For in every mystery there lies not only the darkness of what was done, but the light of what is learned. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries, where every secret is revealed by the soft glow of candlelight.
Until next time, dear listener, another secret fades by candlelight.